This meeting of Norwood City Council is hereby called to order. Please rise for the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. Our Father, who art in heaven, as a body we congregate in these council chambers. We pray for thy divine guidance, that we may do all things well, according to thy holy will. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everyone. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo. Here. Mr. Clark.
Here.
Mrs. Stickley.
Here.
Mr. Blair. Here. Mrs. Hanrahan.
Here.
Mr. Sanker. Here. Mr. Mumper.
Here.
All members are present. We have 3 requests to amend the agenda. The first is to add 2 standing committees. The first is Housing, Health, and Recreation Committee report, and the second would be the Finance, Budget, and Audit Committee. And then a communication, which would be communication number 1, a letter from Keith Moore regarding executive session. Mr. Mumper.
I move we amend the agenda as you just stated.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Next is the minutes of the August 8th, 2017 meeting, which were distributed by email. Mr. Clark.
Move to approve the minutes as of read.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We have no request to address council on agenda items, so we will move on to standing committees. The first is the Housing, Health, and Recreation. Mrs. Hanrahan.
Thank you. To the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Housing, Health, and Recreation, to whom was referred dog tethering, right-of-way, the Devil Strip, and zoning issues, beg leave to submit the following report. Committee requests that the Law Department draft an ordinance concerning dog tethering. Committee requests an ordinance regulating the Devil Strip or city right-of-way. Respectfully submitted, Marilyn Hanrahan, Chairperson, Brandon Blair, James Bonsall, and Tammy Stickley.
Mr. Bonsall.
I move the committee report be approved.
Seconded by Mr. Clark. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We'll move on to Finance, Budget, and Audit. Mr. Sanker?
Yes, Madam President. Your committee report from Finance, Budget, and Audit dated 8/21/2017. To the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Finance, Budget, and Audit, to whom was referred City Finances and 2017 Appropriations, beg leave to submit the following report. The committee and the auditor, along with the fire chief, discussed the 2017 appropriations and the changes to be made to match the adopted recovery plan. We recommend the Exhibit A be approved. We also discussed letters received from the fire and police chief requesting additional funds. We recommend sending a letter to the state auditors as how to handle emergency requests. Respectfully submitted, Joe Sanker, Andrew Clark, John Mumper, and Tammy Stickley.
Mr. Mumper.
I move the committee report be accepted.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We'll move on to second reading of ordinances. It's an ordinance amending sections 1111.118 and 1121.05 of Part 11 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Planning and Zoning Code. Much pleasure. This is the one we are having the public hearing on September the 26th, but we can have the first and second readings prior to that public hearing. Mr. Bonsall.
I move that we have the second reading of the ordinance and not have the third reading until the September 26th meeting.
Second by Mrs. Hanahan. Is there any discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to say, just for people at home, this is to amend the zoning code to prohibit, I guess, medical marijuana type facilities in the city of Norwood. There just being a lot of uncertainty about what that might entail. We're trying to kind of be a little proactive here. And again, that public hearing is going to be on the 26th, so invite anybody that has any comments they want to make to come by councils at 7:30.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to have the second reading and to postpone the third reading until following the public hearing on September 26th. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumber.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries.
Ordinance amending sections 1111.118 and 1121.05 of Part 11 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Norwood, Ohio, entitled Planning and Zoning Code.
We'll move on to introductory reading of ordinances. The first is an ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2017 and declaring an emergency. Mr. Mumper.
Move we suspend the rules, have all three readings by caption.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Mr. Sanker.
Yes, Madam President, just briefly, there are a number of changes, a very long Exhibit A, but these changes are necessary to match the recovery plan that we approved and submitted to the recovery board, to the state auditors, to the committee. And there are a lot of changes in a lot of different areas, but it's to meet what we had already approved for the recovery plan. And so that's why there are so many, because we have to match our appropriations to that plan. So that's the reason for this long list of changes.
And I will note that both of the financial supervisors reviewed this. We had an original one, and then they reviewed it and made a couple of changes back. Mr. Sanker.
Yes, Madam President. We actually, the original one we looked at last night. We, as a committee, looked at making some changes with some questions as to why they were there, listed it in the first place. So we made the changes and then resubmitted them to them with our questions on that, and they came back and said, no, this is how we have to have it listed. So anyhow, that's the reason for it, and that's why this doesn't match our last Exhibit A. There's a couple minor changes, a couple of them I think were in the health administration. We questioned that, and the health environmental, that was another one that come to mind. But,
environmental.
Yeah. So those were a couple we questioned, and we changed back, and they said, no, this is how we need them listed. So those are probably the biggest way if you look at them and see why this is different than what we did last night.
So there was some discussion about taking another look at the health environmental, and if we need to make changes to those, then what would have to happen is the recovery plan would have to be amended and approved by you and then sent to the recovery committee for approval if indeed those changes needed to be made. So we'll be tracking that. I had a conversation with Mr. Stith. He was on his way out of town today, but I did have a conversation with him, and he was aware of it. If we'll be monitoring that health environmental, there was money appropriated in the medical part of the key instead of the environmental key, as I understand it, and so there may need to be a change to the plan, because Mr. Sanker is absolutely correct. What is on here is what has to match the recovery plan. So as we said all along, the recovery plan is a fluid document. As things come up, it may need to be amended, so hence the changes that were in this Exhibit A. Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to suspend the rules. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have all three readings.
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2017 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2017 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2017 and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Mumper.
Move the ordinance be passed.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Mr. Sanker.
Madam President, just a little follow-up on this, and from our committee report, there's been some questions as far as council's ability to change appropriations to what council would like to see, potentially outside of the realm of the plan. We have a draft of a letter that the committee recommended to send to our state auditor review folks for, is there a procedure set up for emergency funding or emergency changes that can be made to the recovery plan or our appropriations? Is there a procedure set up for emergency type expenditures or to change the plan and appropriations? Because we had some questions on that last night, and Mr. Stith was not really aware of what that procedure would be. So we have a draft of a letter that the committee were going to send to April and Anna Mary to see if there is a procedure set up, what the steps are that we need to follow, and when these emergency type expenditures may come up over and above what was listed in the appropriations and the recovery plan. So once we get everybody's who's from the committee approval to type that up, we're going to send that to them to get some feedback from them on what procedures are available to us if we needed to make emergency appropriations, and who deems the responsibility of letting council move forward with that. So that is in the process of being done right now. So.
Thank you, Mr. Sanker. Good information. Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to pass the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Next is an ordinance forgiving the repayment of fund advances made to the Street Fund 02, the Highway Fund 03, and the FEMA Grant Fund 18, and declaring an emergency. Mr. Clark.
Move that we suspend the rules and have all three readings of this ordinance.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Mr. Sanker.
Again, this ordinance here pertains to the recovery plan, the details that we have worked out in there so that the recovery plan matches with the funding in these funds, because they're not going to be repaid on these things here. So it was something where it was almost like a loan where we can forgive the payment. And that was discussed back when we were going through the recovery process, and we decided to make this, to approve this ordinance once we got the plan approved, and to move forward with that. So.
Thank you, Mr. Sanker. Is there any other discussion? Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. I just had a question, possibly to Mr. Sanker through the chair. But with the FEMA grant fund, I was just curious, kind of originally what that was for, what we loaned money to for that.
What?
The FEMA grant fund.
The question is the FEMA grant fund, the $29,561. Do you recall what that was for?
I do not, but I definitely find out tomorrow.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. I guess matter either way. I mean, either way, these, especially the street fund, the highway fund. I mean, we're not going to take money from our streets, the little that we have, to repay it back, to pay back the general fund loan. So it all makes sense. I appreciate it.
Is there any other discussion? The motion on the floor is to suspend the rules. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Senker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. Please have all three readings.
Ordinance forgiving the repayment of fund advances made to the Street Fund 02, the Highway Fund 03, and the FEMA Grant Fund 18 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance forgiving the repayment of fund advances made to the Street Fund 02, the Highway Fund 03, and the FEMA Grant Fund 18 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance forgiving the repayment of fund advances made to the Street Fund 02, the Highway Fund 03, and the FEMA Grant Fund 18, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Clark.
Move to pass the ordinance.
Seconded by Mrs. Stickley. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Senker.
Yes.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We have no administration reports or resolutions or other requests to address council. Is there any unfinished business? Mrs. Hanahan.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to ask the Clerk of Council to send a letter to the Planning Commission updating the Health, Housing, Recreation Committee on the zoning issues the committee had requested.
This was from a previous request?
Yes.
Okay. Just to clarify, you know what these are? Okay. All right. Thank you, Ms. Hanahan.
Thank you.
Any other unfinished business? Any new business? Mr. Senker.
Yes, Madam President, I would like to announce on Saturday, 8/26, I believe it's either 12:30 or 1:30, they're having a reunion car show, basically it's going to be a piece of history from the General Motors plant. Will take place behind the old Quality Inn, and there are going to be some historical cars there from the plant and some of the people that have worked there with information, about the plant. But they're having a car show on 8/26 behind the Quality Inn. It either starts at like 12:30 or 1:30, so you may be able to go online for Norwood Car Show if need be. But I apologize I just remembered the date in my daytimer. So, but if you can attend, I'm sure they'd love to have a lot of folks. It has been in the past a pretty daggone decent car show.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Senker. Any other new business? Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. So coming up, I guess August 29th is the 1-year, anniversary of the rain event that caused, quite a bit of flooding in people's basements and sewer backups. And so MSD, of course, as many people have known, they've been helping to cover some of the costs if there were sewer backups in people's basements. And so I just basically want to remind everybody that if you haven't gotten your paperwork in there, to just get back on that. You've got 2 years to officially submit it. But if your claim's already been approved and you just need to submit all of your paperwork, I really just encourage you to get that done as soon as possible, just for your sake and then for MSD's sake. And then the second part of this is that there's going to be like a community event at Victory Park as part of an ongoing project called Project Reclaim Victory. Eric Thompson, there was a thing on the news about it just a couple of days ago, but him and residents have been meeting at the park and really just trying to bring life back into the park. And there's been Chief Wallace, Chief Kramer, many police and firefighters from the city, other community leaders have all participated and helped to bring energy back to the park. And so the next one is Sunday, August 27th. It's from 3 to 4 o'clock, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. And I just really encourage everybody just to stop by and help to reclaim victory. So, thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall. Is there any other new business? Mr. Clark.
Yeah, this Saturday is the next Williams Avenue Community Garden Farmers Market. There's 2 left, so make sure you make it out. It's from 9 to noon this Saturday at the corner of Williams Avenue and Ellesmere.
Thank you. It's always fun.
Yeah.
Any other new business? On your desks tonight, I passed out a trauma report from Cincinnati Children's Hospital where I work. This is the department that I work for, and the reason that I put it out here for you is that, as some of you may know, we do some population health interventions in the city where if you have a child under the age of 5 in your home, there's a group called PIN, Preventing Injuries in Norwood, and they will come into your home to install safety equipment. And on page 6, there are several pictures of Norwood firefighters. Norwood is the only community, not only did we start this in Norwood, now it is in about 10 or 12 different communities, but originated in Norwood. And we do safety days twice a year. The next one is coming up at the end of September. But because we really wanted to kind of just really make sure that this program took off in Norwood. We wanted to make sure that we could reach other people throughout the year other than the 2 safety days. And so the Norwood Fire Department agreed to be trained in the procedures and the education, and they have the equipment at the fire station, so if they do a run and they see somebody who needs the equipment, or if Children's gets a referral or a call from someone who needs the equipment, they don't have to wait till the 2 safety days to get it done. The Norwood Fire Department goes out when they have some downtime and they install that equipment. And so they're featured on page 6, which is why I wanted to make sure that you had it to know that not only about the great work that they do, but Cincinnati Children's thought enough of that work that they included them in their trauma report. So just kudos to Norwood Fire Department for the good work that they do. And we'll be doing those safety days the end of September, whatever the last Saturday is in September. I think it's the 29th or 30th of September. I think it's the 30th, we'll be doing another safety day in Norwood where anyone who has children under the age of 5 can get these pieces of safety equipment installed in their home. Is there any other new business? Mr. Clark.
If I could ask a question. I believe back earlier in the year we passed dates for the yard sale in September. Does anybody recall what those dates were?
It is coming up, and it's
like
in
the second week.
It's the 8th and 9th, I think.
It's I just read it in the newsletter.
It's the 8th and
It's the 8th and 9th of September.
Okay, thank you.
It was in the senior newsletter. But yes, those are the 8th and 9th of September. The citywide yard sale. So if people want to be part of the advertising of that, they need to come to City Hall and get a permit in the auditor's office. And then that list of people who have gotten, there's no cost for the permit, but you have to have the permit, and then they'll be advertised. That list will be on the Facebook page and be available for folks who come in so that people will know who is having the yard sale. Good catch. Is there any other new business? All right. We'll move on to communications, and the first is a letter from Keith Moore regarding executive session request.
Dear Mr. Brown, I am writing to request that council go into executive session at its August 22nd, 2017 meeting to discuss pending and imminent litigation. Thank you for your consideration. Keith Moore, Norwood Law Director.
Mrs. Stickley.
I move the letter be received and filed and that we go into executive session to discuss pending and imminent litigation.
Seconded by Mr. Blair. Is there any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzo.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanrahan.
Yes.
Mr. Sanker.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye, the motion carries. We will go into executive session, so we ask those in the audience to leave, and if you will turn off the sound and the TV recording. We will come back into regular session, but only to adjourn. We will not have any other business after coming out of executive session. we are back in regular session. We have no absent members. Mr. Mumper.
I move we adjourn.
Seconded by Mrs. Stickley. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Bonzall.
Yes.
Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mrs. Stickley.
Yes.
Mr. Blair.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanahan.
Yes.
Mr. Senker.
Yes.
Mr. Mumper.
Yes.
All members present voting aye. The motion carries. This meeting is hereby adjourned.